immune from having horses that are challenged by spring growth, and it's certainly a great time to have a discussion around that. So we have Mark with us, and I'm going to hand over to Mark. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions, and you can do that in the chat room. Type any messages or questions you may have, and we'll endeavour to cover them after Mark's main commentary. And so it'll be quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, and we can then we can answer any questions that come through, but just hold off for the first 10 minutes or so, and then feel free to pop them in there. We'll endeavour to get to all of them in due course. So I'll hand over to Mark. Thanks for joining us again, Mark. It's awesome, and let's kick on.
Hi, Colin. Yeah, thank you. Hello to everybody. It's good to be back to having another little online chat with everybody about a few things with horses and feeding horses and so on. Talking to Colin the other day, we were talking about sort of topical things coming up and what we could do to discuss with this. And we thought, well, spring's on its way, and spring always, we always think of butterflies and baby animals and all this sort of stuff, but there's a lot of more bigger issues when you're talking about with feeding horses that come along around springtime, and one of the main one is the spring grasses, getting that initial growth after the winter time coming through. All of a sudden you've gone from minimal feed to an abundance of feed, hopefully, unless we have another drought, which we will again at some stage. That'll be a different topic to talk about. But you got this flush of feed, plenty there. Everything's great. The horse is going great, going along. Everything seems fine. Then all of a sudden your horse starts to get laminitis, or it's putting on too much weight and showing signs of equine metabolic syndrome and all these other conditions, and your vet comes out and you've got them on anti-inflammatories and Pastures and all these sorts of drugs, and it starts costing. So these are the pitfalls of what's the coming up season, the one that's coming very shortly. And I just wanted to sort of run through a few of the things, the pitfalls, and how to sort of avoid some of those issues. So obviously the main thing is the actual rapid increase in growth of your grasses during their spring times. Certain species of grasses will respond at certain times. A lot of your native grasses will be a little bit later on. They're more used to hotter and drier conditions, because that's kind of the norm in this country. You introduce species, things like your ryegrasses, cocksfoots and so forth. They're a little bit later on. A little bit earlier on when the season's a bit cooler. Obviously varies a little bit from region to region. But one of the biggest things that you find when you've got this flush of grass coming through is it's a survival mechanism for the grasses. Is they now got more sunlight and warmer conditions. So as a result, photosynthesis starts to kick in a lot more. It never stops throughout the year, but the conditions have now improved to a point where we can get this rapid growth. Now that's great. You get the feed and so forth, and it's gone past from this little tiny peak to now a reasonable amount there. But the problem is with this photosynthesis, you get the increase in production of your sugars. And the sugars get broken up into different classifications of sugars. And when we talk about them, the main ones with horses, an umbrella term for them is non-structural carbohydrates. So your NSC, you often see that. Now, your non-structural carbohydrates are your sugars plus your starches. Now, starch, we've heard a lot about those sorts of things, and it's something we got to be very mindful of, be very careful of. and something of sort of trivial pursuit type thing is to know that starch is actually a monomer of glucose. So it's a glucose molecule just put in a different chemical structure, and it becomes 3 times more resistant to digestion in the small intestine. So it's really just a sugar, just a modified sugar. The other ones that we really focus on, and these are the ones that we start to look about in our feeds, and particularly in this case, our spring grasses, are our simple sugars and our fructans. Now, when you do a measure of your sugars in your grasses, and any of your feeds, to be honest, you'll often see there will be either a WSC or an ESC, and then you'll get a starch. Now, your WSC is your water-soluble carbohydrates. These are a total count of the sugars in there. The ESC is your ethanol-soluble carbohydrates. These are ones that are dissolvable in the ethanol products. So we're all very much used to ethanol now. That's the hand cleansing type thing. It's actually an alcohol that can be used in various things, and in feed analysis, it's a dissolving alcohol. The ethanol soluble carbohydrates is the one from the horse perspective that we are more interested in than any of the other measures. The reason for that, that's basically your simple sugars. These are your glucoses, your sucroses, your fructoses, your maltoses, and all the rest of one. And by the way, if you see anything that says OSE on the end of it, that means sugar. So these are your simple sugars. These are the ones that are digested, absorbed in the small intestine, travel through the blood, used as an energy source, or stored in the muscle as glycogen, or can, if they're not utilized in any of those ways, they then get stored on the animal as a fat deposit. The reason why we are very interested and concerned about those, these are the ones that produce your insulin response. They're the ones that get in the body. You get the insulin, gets detected, because once it gets absorbed they're primarily in the form of glucose. Glucose is detected, insulin is secreted from the pancreas, and you end up with this insulin resistance occurring. You also end up with, as we know now, high inflammatory responses, which is one of the key causes of laminitis in horses, and that is the condition called hyperinsulinemia, where there's too much insulin in the body. And this is why you can find a horse that's never had laminitis before in its life out in a paddock during springtime and in autumn time, and I'll touch on that in a little bit later, and where all of a sudden, no, it's never had a problem, all of a sudden it now gets severe case of laminitis, and just from then on it's always got laminitis. And it's this chronic exposure to high sugars which is very much present within the actual pastures around this springtime, because the grasses are now taking off, they're growing, they need as much energy as they possibly can. They've survived through winter, now it's growth time, photosynthesis kicks in, they're recharging the batteries, their battery comes in the form of sugars, they've got to get as much of it right up into the leaves, down to the roots, everywhere basically. So you end up with a real abundance of sugars in your grasses. The other issue there too is the length of your grass. Now, it's a simple dilution situation. A very short grass, it's got a lot of photosynthesis going on and have a lot of sugar in a very concentrated form. So when you see your grasses very small, growing during that springtime, heading towards the summertime, you know that that grass is going to be very potent in the sugar side of things. And that is something to be very, very mindful of when you're turning your horses out. If you're putting them out in paddocks, you're going to be very mindful of the length of it. If it's a much longer length, you could still have the same quantity, same concentration of sugars within that leaf, But now you've got something that is potentially 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 times the length. So a dilution factor kicks in there. The horse is eating more. It's got the same amount of sugars as the short one, but because the length of it, they're eating more from that diluted out leaf with the sugars. So they're not as, there's not as much overall sugars going in at a time. I've got a little slide that I wanted to show. I'm hoping this works. I was mucking around with it earlier with Colin, so let's fingers crossed this thing's going to work for us. Although it's not coming up on my.
Here it is.
Anyway, here we go. I hope everybody. Yep, everybody can see that. Good. Okay. So this is a slide from a pub. Sorry, what's happening?
It's all right. It looks good.
What was that, Colin?
I said they can't tell us if they can't see it because they're on mute.
Oh, well, that's true. Yeah. Shout out if you can't see it. This is a slide from a publication from Richards, Bailey and McGilchrist some years ago. And it's a slide that the laminitis group based in the US that promote quite well, and it's simply because it's such a nice, neat, tidy demonstration of the type of or the concentrations of sugars naturally found in as a good representation in the pastures here in Australia. You can see they've broken it down into the 4 different seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. And you can see the yellow part's your starch, your blue is your fructans, and the red is the our ethanol soluble carbohydrates. Now, I haven't said much about fructans. I should do it now before we progress, because I mentioned before that ethanol soluble carbohydrates are your simple sugars less your fructans. The importance of that is fructans, as I did also mention, is far more resistant to digestion in the small intestine to what your normal sugars are. So they end up in the hindgut and being fermented. Now, it's not such a huge issue because, as you can see, I don't know if my mouse works or not for everybody to see, but you can see that you're looking from in autumn an average about 2% up to maybe about 5% of the entire dry matter made up of fructans. So they're not high in concentration. The microbes can use them. The microbes, what you're going to understand, they do need some sugars. It's an energy source for them. So fructans are quite a safe energy source for those microbes to utilize. They don't convert it into lactose, and lactose or lactic acid, that's the one that has drops your pH within the large intestine in the hindgut, which can lead to acidosis, and that results in the death of your microbes and the release of endotoxins, and then that ends up with conditions like leaky gut syndrome, colic, and so on. So fructans are quite fine. They're not a major issue. They are a sugar, but they're not an evil sugar. How about we label them like that? It's your ethanol soluble carbohydrates, your simple sugars. They're the ones to be concerned about. And you can see here when you're looking at it, summer is very low. And that may not make a lot of sense because you go, well, that's the highest time of photosynthesis, but it's all the seasonal things. Sunlight is one part of it. You also got to think of the temperatures. You got to think of the actual climate that's at the time. Is it really dry, which it usually is? You got a lot of plants that are shifting from being rapid growth to now steady growth, even starting to die off because of the heat. So it starts to shrink back down. But when you look in autumn, it's going up, and your highest levels are during spring and winter. Now, I'm saying here, no, we need to be very careful of our grasses during the springtime and also during autumn time. And yeah, here's these high levels during winter time. Now, what's going on? Well, the issue here is, as we all know, during the winter time, the growth is actually very short. So there's not a lot of grass there. So that high levels of sugars are really more of a surviving mechanism, because what happens is the plant's detects that it's getting colder, so it starts to put those sugars in as a storage protection. It's protecting itself against conditions like frost and so on. It's it starts to use it like an antifreeze. You get sugars around, it can protect itself against the frost, the snow, and those sorts of things. And that frost stress is the reason why you have so much troubles during the autumn time. You get a lot of these, a lot of the sugars starting to rise up during autumn, and your plants are stressed because of frost during the autumn going into winter. As a result, the sugars start to come in as an antifreeze, and you're getting this, you got a longer length of grass that the horse can still eat on, and you got higher levels of sugars. So then you start leading into conditions with laminitis, PPID, and those sorts of things. But the real thing is to have a look at the red bar in the spring one. You can see it is actually the largest bar there. You're looking at nearly 10% of the dry matter is made up of, and this is just an average thing. So you got to realize this is over various species of grasses over a large areas within Australia. Some of these grasses can have over 30% of the dry matter made up of sugars. Others, obviously, a lot less. So when you put them average together, you got something that's around 10 to 15%. And once you start getting over that 10%, it starts to become quite unsafe for laminitic prone horses. So you can see these laminitic prone horses, you've got an average figure around 10, 15, maybe a little bit more of your sugars because they've got this rapid growth. So springtime is a very dangerous time with sugars, and these are the reasons why. And this is why you've got to be very mindful when to graze them. There are periods of times, obviously you're talking photosynthesis. So as the day goes along, your photosynthesis gets greater. So in the morning, it's a lot less. It's only starting out. By the end of the day, you recharge your battery. Overnight, you go through a process called respiration, and that's where the plant uses those sugars to actually keep itself alive, keep it going, and then it recharges again through photosynthesis during the day. So your safest time is anywhere, during our spring into summer, is from around about 4 o'clock in the morning, if you're keen enough to get up that time in the morning, let your horse out, through to around about 10. Early in spring, you could probably push it out 12 in the morning, lunchtime. Once you start getting out and the days are getting longer and hotter, you really need to be making that more between about 4 and 10 in the morning type thing. Sometimes, some places even less. Some horses, you may have to completely remove them off the actual off the pastures at all and stop feeding them in that manner, which is where hand feeding is going to be very, very important, and making sure that they've got that fiber, those nutrients going through. Same issue with your sugars will pass through to your hays. The grasses that your horses are grazing on are going to have that's got those high sugars in them, are going to be the same ones. They're going to be cut and baled, used for hay, chaff, that sort of thing. So you have to be very mindful of that during that period of time. Then you might go, okay, well, I can't put my horse out on the paddock because of the amount of sugars that's in there. So I'll feed it on hay. And depending on the species of hay that you're using, the variety of grass or pasture that's involved, you could be feeding something that is 20, 25, 30% sugars, and that defeats the whole purpose. Now, yes, you can turn around, you can soak that hay, and that will reduce it. And certainly, we've seen very good reductions in sugars and so forth over about a 30-minute to an hour period. My recommendation is not to go any longer than an hour of soaking. In fact, I'm more inclined to say, hey, look, 15 to 30 minutes is about the ideal level. After about 30 minutes, the amount of sugars that are dissolved away into the waters really drops off. The rate of loss out of your passes, out of your hays, drops off quite dramatically after about 30 minutes. The things you start to see too is some of your nutrients start to get dissolved away as well. So you're losing the quality within your hay. The other thing too, after about 20 minutes, you start to see, and studies have shown this, you start to see an increase in pathogenic bacteria developing. After an hour or so, you really start to see quite a heavy load of these bacteria. In the early days of this sort of thing, people used to say they soaked their hay overnight and fed it out. Test of that shows loads of bacteria on there that actually are at the toxic levels. So that's highly unrecommended. My suggestion, no more than 30 minutes, you get a good reduction, but also consider your type of hays. Also consider alternative types of feeds as well while you're doing that. Another consideration when we're talking about with your pastures and so on, particularly in early spring, is that they're not going to be highly abundant in nutrients. Now, a lot of that relates to two things. One, our soils. Our soils aren't the best soils in the world. We don't have the high organic material in them like you do in the Northern Hemisphere. We don't have the season that allows that sort of thing. We didn't have the glacial activity from millions of years ago to take away all the rocks and leave good earth material there. So our soils are quite poor. They're very high in iron. They're very high in potassium. Those two things are very nutrient inhibiting. They will stop absorption of a lot of nutrients. So you need to look at counteracting that. You need to look at supplying a feed or a product, a supplement or something to make sure that you've got good levels of nutrients in there. Most soils have got pretty good levels of calcium in there. A lot of the soils have got good levels of phosphorus. Even up north, there's good levels of phosphorus. It's just the form that it's in means it's very hard for the plant to absorb it up. So lots of your parts of Northern Australia are not phosphorus deficient, as it sort of makes it stand out. The grasses are phosphorus deficient because the form of which the phosphorus is in, it's hard for the plant to take it up and use. But most places it's pretty good with that sort of thing. It's more your trace minerals, your copper, your zinc, your manganese. Oh, well, not so much manganese. There's usually pretty good levels in the soils for manganese, but definitely copper, zinc, selenium, iodine. They're usually very low, and they need to be supplemented with a better feed of some sort of type. And I'm sure Colin and his team can certainly help you on those sort of things with the types of feeds that they've got. The other thing too is to consider during your springtime, there's very high levels of potassium in the actual grasses. Now, I said before that's an inhibitor. The other part about it too is potassium works in conjunction, or kind of the opposite really. When one is up, the other one is down, type thing. So they work in conjunction with each other and in keeping the normal physiological functions within the body working. An example of that is one of thousands really of different functions, but these two salts involved, or minerals involved with are the simple transport of nutrients from the gut into the body. a lot of the larger molecules are transferred through transport proteins, and there's a transport channel mechanism that's key for the transport of a lot of these things. Excuse me, and that is called the sodium potassium ATPase pump. And what it works on is those three components at the start of it: sodium, potassium, and ATP. ATP is the energy within it's adenosine triphosphate, and is basically the energy within the cells. So requires sodium and potassium and a bit of energy in there, and it's what's called facilitated transport. And what happens is you have an interchange of the two molecules that allows that main nutrient, whatever molecule it be, whether it be a protein, or whether it be a mineral, a vitamin, whatever, it then is allowed, it gets attached, transfers through the cells, through the luminal wall into the body, through this interchange between the two molecules, sodium and potassium. Now, if you have too much of one and not enough of the other, that mechanism starts to break down, because it's one swap for the other one type thing. So if you got not enough of one, then you don't get this full channel transfer happening. So as a result, you're not getting enough of those nutrients in the body, even if you are feeding at a very good level. So it's very important this time of year to consider supplying a good salt source that is in a palatable way for it. Now, I say it's in a palatable way because the issue here is the horse, its body and its mind, cannot distinguish between potassium salt and sodium salt. Potassium chloride, sodium chloride to the body is exactly the same thing. So you need to trick the body into getting more sodium into it, and you have to put it in a source that is palatable, a source that is for a horse to be able to, that will readily consume, absorb, and we start to get this balance happening once again. So this time of year, we always talk about adding salt to the horse's diet during summertime for the heat, sweat loss, and so on. I'd probably turning around and this is the physiology side of me coming out and saying, hey, yeah, look, that's very, very important, but perhaps the next few months, this is probably more important to be putting salt into your horse's diet to make sure you're getting this interaction and counteraction happening. Because if you've got more sodium into the body through the form of salts, the potassium that's there, that's coming in from the feeds, it will be excreted out of the body or not as absorbed. So then you start to get the balance happen again. So when you're looking at the grasses this time of year, springtime grasses, be very mindful that your rapid growth is going to be high levels of sugars in there. You saw in the graph. You're going to have high levels of those simple sugars. Don't be concerned about the fructans. They're not a problem. They're actually quite beneficial for your horse. But those simple sugars are very, very important. That's something that you need to be mindful of. You need to consider your feeding plan. Can I turn my horse out? Should I use a grazing muzzle? That's a choice up to you. Me, I look at it from a holistic perspective, and I think from a welfare perspective, I'm not a fan of grazing muzzles. I understand what they're for. I just don't think that's a good way. It's a bit like taking a chocolate addict and taking their mouth up and their hands up and saying, okay, here you are at Darrell Lee, just stand here for the next 3 hours. It's not the nicest thing, I think. I think there are better ways. Restricted grazing, turn out into areas where there is no grass, just an alternative low sugar feed of good quality, good nutrients. Let them graze that way, let them move around, well, actually, that's probably the best way to do it, I would think. Yeah, minimal access to it. and make sure that there's good nutrients, salt as well, and you will minimize. Some horses, unfortunately, do have a still will be have disposed, I should say, to laminitis. So they're going to be a completely painful existence over the next few months. But you just got to be mindful of these sort of things and make sure you've got good quality nutrients in there. I could probably keep going for ages, but I imagine there's probably a few questions and things and more stuff that can be added. So I'll stop there, Colin, and I'll let you go.
Thank you. There's a few questions coming in, Mark, and I'll read them. From Naomi, 2 questions. Isn't benchmark a complete feed? Why would I add salt? And we get a lot of people adding salt as a matter of course into diets as well, even if they're feeding a complete feed. But have you got a comment on that?
Yeah, look, a complete feed certainly is required to try and balance out at every single element you can. The only thing is seasonal variations. You're going to have your outliers of certain elements, and you can't count for one and the other. There's going to be times where you don't need anywhere near as much salt. For example, in wintertime, you don't need a huge amount of salt during that time, whereas in summertime, and as I've said, in springtime, you're going to need a hell of a lot more than the norm. It's really, I guess, adding that little bit extra. Perfect Match is definitely a complete feed. It was designed that way. It's meant to be fed that way. But sometimes you just got to add that little bit extra, as in the salt, just to top it up for those seasonal times, those conditions, which are just that little bit more unusual. If you're living in a high humid environment, you're going to need a hell of a lot more salt than if you're living in a hot, dry environment type thing, because the sweating is going to be far less. So it's just adding a little bit extra. It's cheap. It does your horse good. Anything excess, not a problem. That'll be easily excreted out or not absorbed. But it just shores it up and just adds that little bit extra to your complete feed.
So just before I ask you the next question, if you were feeding a salt block, for example, a lot of people feed a salt block, do you think that the salt intake of horses sort of self-regulates salt intake, or do they just scoff the salt block because they like the taste, or do they back off once they think they've had enough salt?
There is a point, studies have shown there is a point where horses will stop, for sure. There's always a point where too much of a good thing is not a good thing. Salt is not really a toxic element. Sodium is quite abundant. Chloride, converted into chlorine, can be, but the body is obviously well adapted to dealing with chlorine, that it can very easily dispose of it, whether it be in the urine or whether it be through limited absorption. Some horses do get a taste for them, absolutely, and they just devour them like lollies, for sure. And salt is more of an addictive thing for horses than sugars. So yeah, it's really some salt blocks can be good. Some salt blocks may not. It's a horses for courses type situation. If you find that your horse is just going to completely devour a salt block non-stop, it's not. Yeah, it's a lesser of evils type thing. But I guess your question is, are they self-regulating? I think under most circumstances, no. Animals, humans, we can't really self-regulate. We don't know when we need a certain element. We just know we need something, and we consume it. We feel better, therefore we consume it again till we get to a point where we go, I don't really feel like that, and that's when you stop. So that's the point of self-regulation, and that's how the body works, as a negative feedback.
So it's a little bit like Cadbury's chocolate, with me and Cadbury, the relationship I have with Cadbury's chocolate. That's not self-regulated at all. Naomi also asked how much salt should she add if she's feeding perfect mash, for example, and it's summer or spring. What's the sort of rule of thumb for adding salt to the diet?
It will come down a lot to how much they're sweating, that sort of thing. But I think under most circumstances, you can get away with pretty much just a handful of salt. It really does. Yeah, so 20, 30 grams type thing. Yeah, that'd be a reasonable thing to throw in there. Obviously, heavy sweating, you're going to need to add in a little bit more. So harder work, more hot, humid conditions, a little bit extra will be needed. Under extreme conditions, I'd be looking at doubling that. Under most circumstances, around that 20, 30 grams, basically. So I know I should be very precise and that sort of thing, but I know also how it is from a practical perspective. So I usually just say to people, hey, look, just put your hand, grab a handful of that, throw it in your horse's feed, and that'll be pretty well. You'll be pretty close to it within probably 5 grams or so.
So when you consider putting in electrolytes, which are obviously common different salts, versus just plain sodium chloride, what's your comment on that? That's another question from Naomi. Okay,
well, most of your electrolytes is sodium chloride. Then on top of that, you'll have calcium, magnesium, and then maybe a little bit of the other stuff as well. But the difference between an electrolyte and just straight table salt, which is sodium chloride, is you just basically, with the sodium chloride, you're just basically looking at adding sodium in there to counteract the high levels of potassium. It's a balancing out type thing. Your electrolytes are something that's very necessary when you're looking at a horse that's in high levels of activity or has certain conditions that would benefit from having a higher level of these additional salts as well, not just your sodium and your chloride, but also your calcium, your magnesium, you can have, and your phosphates and that sort of thing. And that can be things like you're tying up. There seems to be a bit of a benefit there by adding in electrolytes, and a few other sort of conditions are starting to show that, electrolytes could be beneficial. So it's again, horses for courses. If you're looking at just balancing that higher level of potassium, as I said, that's common in the grasses, particularly your spring grasses, just stick with table salt or a lick block or something like that. If you're looking at a horse that is in higher activity, and therefore is sweating, an electrolyte might be beneficial. Remembering though, that your main salts that you're looking at losing being calcium, magnesium, sodium and chloride are quite abundant in your feeds. So if you already got good levels or slightly above what your horse needs of those, and your horse is only in a bit of light to moderate activity with a bit of light sweating type thing, I wouldn't be worried about an electrolyte at that point unless you got a horse that is prone to tying up. When you start exerting and when they start getting a decent lather of sweat on them, then yes, you will have to add more in there. And the idea is to try and get it in at an earlier stage after they've done their activity, so you can replenish it as quickly as possible to prevent any muscle damage.
Brilliant. Thank you. Question from Lucy. If you have a laminated horse or pony, what's the best benchmark feed to give? Thanks for the question, Lucy.
Hi, Lucy. Best benchmark feed for a laminated horse, I definitely would be sticking with the mashers as the base. Absolutely. Colin can correct me on these ones, but I think we're looking at something that's only around about 2 to 3% sugars for both of them. But definitely, you've got the hindgut fermentation that they're renowned for, so you got plenty of energy there. If you're looking at a horse that has to have restricted grazing and is going to be a little bit less on the nutrients, I would be looking at definitely considering the perfect mash. You've got those abundant levels of nutrients in there. It's going to boost that physiological function. It's going to help boost that immune system. So it starts counteracting any issues that come with laminitis. But yeah, your key starting point is definitely using the mashers. You getting your grain levels right down, getting your sugars level right down. Remembering your fructans are not an issue, it's just simple sugars. So eliminating as much of that as possible is ideal. Looking at your type of hays, go with it. Again, consider a grassy hay. Mindful of your lucins. They can, because they're highly digestible, they can, and if you're on weight, so the laminized comes with an EMS horse, they're going to struggle to lose that because they're going to get more out of the digestion of that. So look at a grassy hay, but make sure it's one that's lower in your sugars, or at least you soak them for say half an hour and make sure you throw that water away. But yeah, start with your mashers and build up from there.
Thanks, Mark. Question from Leonie, who's on the Gold Coast. Coming into spring on the Gold Coast, we go into a dry, windy bushfire season through August and September. Should we be more careful re sugars in summer when our rains come in, or regardless? Is it still spring grass up here as per the graph? So does the graph relate to the seasons on the Gold Coast, or is it?
Yeah, good question. And I hate those ones. Yeah, the graph is probably a little bit less representative of your region up there. Yeah, you're right. You come out of the winter time, you got a bit of dry grass there, you got winds picking up, it's a bushfire type prone area. You've always got to take in consideration the seasons. But also on top of that, you still got to be mindful that you still got an increase in sunlight. There's an increase in warmth. The grasses will start to undertake photosynthesis. They may not be very long, but there will be a green pick underneath there. Remember, I said before, a very short grass at a high point, like in the springtime, can be much more potent than a long length because it's got the same concentration, the same amount of sugar in it, but it's diluted out. So still be very mindful of that. Not so much August, but certainly when your weather starts to warm up. So mid-September onwards type thing, that's when you got to start being mindful. Your rainfall obviously is going to be more of a summer type rainfall, but it's not all about rain. It's a whole combination of the things. There's the sunlight, there's the temperature, those sorts of things. So you can still get very high sugars, high sugar grasses with low rainfall. It's really got a lot to do with the climate, not just the rainfall. So yeah, just be a little bit, keep in mind spring. And you might have to also be a little bit mindful in early summer, but after that, things will start to settle back down again. Easy.
Brilliant. Thank you. we haven't got any more questions that have come in. So everybody's been well satisfied with your answers, I think, Mark.
Either that or they're bored and gone back to sleep.
I know. They're still all here.
Well, that's good.
There's another question from Naomi, which she just reminded me of, that I didn't ask you.
Yep.
If she doesn't have the ability to put horses in and out from grass, what are the options to counteract spring grass? So she's got they're either out or they're in. She can't move them out. But we did cover some of the options on that too, didn't we? Is there anything to counter the spring grass?
Okay.
I think New South Wales, so it's quite seasonal there. So I'm sure spring kicks in with a vengeance.
Yeah.
If I can find Naomi, I might just unmute her and ask you to unmute. Naomi, maybe you can expand on that.
Well, you did briefly there for a moment, Naomi. I heard you say something, and then
I went back on mute. Yeah, I'm off mute now. Yeah. So I'm just moved to Goulburn. My horse isn't probably too bad, but I also have an 8-hand high miniature and an 11-hand high pony, and the miniature at the best of times is a guts, and at springtime he becomes unmanageable. We don't have the option to put him in and out. There's nowhere for us to do that. Is there something we can do to minimise the impact of that spring grass on him?
Yeah, it's very, very tricky because a lot of studies have shown too that if you restrictive turnout, horses, particularly ponies, have this incredible ability to consume up to 5% of their body weight within in an hour's time. So they can consume up to a third of their entire feed intake in just a 1 hour turnout. So it's really, it is really hard in that situation. And I'm not really giving you an answer, am I? I'm kind of dancing around.
No, that's fine. If there's nothing, it only happens for like 3 weeks. It was worth asking the question while I could, if there was anything I could do to help the situation. He just gets a bit of a bee in his bonnet for about 3 weeks, 4 weeks.
Yeah, look, in that situation, like I said before, I'm not a fan of grazing muzzles, but maybe your pony is one of those ones that's a perfect candidate for that period of time to do that. So it can be turned out, spend a bit of time out there running around and so on. And if you are in the situation, you might be able to just turn it out for a little period of time with a grazing muzzle. Only like an hour or something like that, so I can get a bit of exercise, run around, kick, roll, do all those sorts of things, and then put it back in, and then later on turn it out again for another hour and so on. So it is getting a bit of time outside, but not getting access to the grasses. I would definitely not have it turned out to eat for any more than an hour. In fact, I'd probably be reducing even the turnout time to say half an hour, just to minimize it, and then concentrate a lot of the feeding being high fibers, a lot like Lucy has with her horse. Focus on the mashes as the base. Add anything to it that you need to add to it, if you feel like you need to, or if there's any sort of medication you have to for treatment for the laminitis, whatever. But yeah, sometimes, particularly those periods of times, you do have to be a little bit cruel to be kind. So if you can't turn them out onto an area where there's no grass at all, like a yard or anything like that, it's a shame you don't have like a sand yard or something like that and you can just run around. Maybe in that situation, you do have to consider a grazing muzzle, and then just look at short turnouts and making sure they're getting, I'd be looking at something like the perfect mash to be supplied on, particularly for a pony. you're not going to need to feed a hell of a lot to meet its requirements, its daily requirements.
Thank you.
Sorry, Naomi, you carry on.
Oh yeah, just said thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there a role for the fermented fibres? I mean, we've got a partnership with Manuka Haylage, but Manuka over the next 6 months will have some cereal versions. So they have a barley haylage. And would that be a useful tool, Mark, because it would be low sugar?
Yeah, look, that's something that's going to be very interesting to see. What the actual sugar levels come in at. For a laminitic type horse, I'd have to see what the final numbers are with that to whether they're a safe level, but they do come in, say, below 10%. Terrific, absolutely fantastic. The reason I'm looking at that and saying, hey, and people probably going stretching and saying, well, how's this guy's a nutritionist saying feeding a cereal hay type thing? Well, the thing about it is the main issue with your cereal is obviously your sugars. Now, through your microbial fermentation with ensiling it and going through producing the haylage, if that can get those sugars levels down to even below 12%, then your cereals in a lot of ways are a bit more balanced than a lot of your legumes, which is your standard haylage product. Your calcium phosphorus is a little bit more in balance. Your protein levels is definitely a much closer level to what you're looking at, because it has been ensiled, your structural carbohydrates, these are the ones that make up things like the stem part and so on, they're being massively broken down, which makes them much more digestible, so you're getting a lot out of it. So you get more out of it than you will for your by doing as a haylage than you will as a hay by a long way. So yeah, look, there is this high potential for that sort of thing. But that's just talking from a laminitic horse type of situation. A non-laminitic horse, and there's a lot of horses out there that can be on chronic high sugars and won't go get laminitis. And this is the thing, we still don't fully understand the whole situation. We're only just starting to understand it a little bit. So there's a lot more to learn. But there is seem to be a genetic conditioning in there of some sort. So feeding things like your fermentable fibers, your highly fermentable fibers in the form of haylage and so on, will get that nutrients, get that better digestibility, improve that bug by bug, get that better gut health going. That will also have an impact on the immune system, which will help counteract any issues potentially that comes with laminitis. So things like if you can improve the gut health, which you certainly certainly can do with things like haylage and soybean hulls and those sorts of things, your highly fermentable fibers, you can certainly counteract a lot of the negative issues that are prone with things like laminitis and high sugars and that sort of thing. And another thing we've only sort of briefly talked about, and I haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but I'm getting more and more doing, is the benefits that the microbes produce, the enzymes and the different hormones and things that they secrete that go back in and not only improve the overall health of the horse, but also the mental state, so your mental and physiological state, and that only comes with quality fiber in the diet and that fermentation, which leads to your gut health. So it's all definitely interacted. Look, the best feed, honestly, in these situations is getting back to a natural feed, and that is certainly looking at your fermentable fibers.
Thank you, Mark.
I'll stop there, otherwise I'll keep going all night and I will bore everybody to sleep.
Just a quick question from Lucy about when's the oil coming out. We spoke about it in the last Q&A. We're just waiting for the import permit process to complete before we can actually put it on the water, Lucy. So it'll be a little ways away, probably at least 2 months, maybe longer, probably longer than that actually, depending on how the government department, how prompt they are with issuing the permit. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be launching a new product called Benchmark Balancer Mash, which Mark has formulated for us, and trials have been excellent. It's a low feeding rate concentrate, but different to Perfect Mash in that even though it's got a similar base, we also added protein meal. So it's got lupins, soy bean meal, canola meal, soy hulls, but in high levels of vitamins, minerals as well, amino acids. So it's for a horse that's got a whole raft of different uses, as you know, balancers have, but this is a balancer that you can feed dry as a pellet or you can feed it wet as a mash, and it soaks in about 5 minutes. So you could add it, for example, to super fiber mash as the base, add half a kilo or so of the balancer, and you've got a high protein product that provides really high levels of nutrition at a very small feeding rate. So it's a nice versatile product. If you're feeding a pony or a horse that's injured in a stable, it's the perfect product for that. And feeding it in a mash means that it'll last a bit longer. They won't scoff it because you're only feeding a small amount. Or you can mix it again with super fiber mash to make it a bigger feed. But it's really ideal for anything with any metabolic issues as well. Have you got anything you want to add to that, Mark?
Only really that yeah, it can be used as an additive with something, or it can also be used as a base as well, because it's got designed to balance out most diets, and that's the difference between it to Perfect Match, which is a complete feed. A complete feed is you feed it on its own and it'll meet all the requirements of that horse. This one is balancing, so you're adding it to other parts of the diet, and you're balancing and getting it right, picking up what needs to be picked up, and you got low levels of certain things, high levels of other things to make sure you're counteracting and getting to that right level based on what most diets are usually like. So you can add it to something. You can add it to the mashes. You can add it to your golden oldies. You can add it to any of those sort of things. Your cool as, which is a great combination. Actually, just thinking about them, because your cool has is a very low sugar and starch type feed. That's a little bit, for that medium to light to medium type activity type horse, but this will give it that little bit extra in the forms of the nutrients, so they can perform even that little bit higher up without having to go to a heavier sort of energy type level type thing. The other thing too is because, as Colin, you said, it can also be used as a mash. It can be a base, and you can add to it as opposed to it adding to another feed. So you've got the versatility there of going, okay, well, I can add it to that to balance and boost it up, or this is my base and I'll add something to it. Now, whether it be another feed or whether you have, some people may look at adding just a grain or a fiber or something like that, an unprocessed type feed. Well, this adds those nutrients and you can add that to it as well. So it's a very versatile feed.
Absolutely. So we're unwisely from our packaging lady, Caron, who's listening to me now, we're going to do a pre-launch plain pack, because it takes, particularly with COVID and with other limitations, it's going to take us some months to get some amazing bags, which we've finished design and they're now in production. But we decided that the trial work was so successful that we're going to produce it in a plain brown paper bag with a big sticker on it. And we're going to be producing it as from, I think, next week. and it'll be in distribution around the country to all the warehouses from there. So that's something, and we'll put it up on Facebook, and we'll put it up on the website over the next few days as well, so that everybody knows what it's about. But benchmark balancer mash, and it will be the only, I think, mash that around in Australia that you can soak if you want to. You don't have to, but you can if you want to. So I don't think there's any more questions. Thank you, Mark. I'll wrap it up here so we don't, people have obviously got other things to do. Maybe they're going to eat their dinner. But thank you for your time, Mark. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody who's attended does as well. We have captured this on a recording, which we'll put up on our Facebook page. And we've got another session next month, which is some nitty gritty about the effects of fermentation and what really happens downstream from that. And Mark's particularly passionate about that area. So we'll advertise the date for that for next month, but thank you everybody for joining. Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate your time, and thank you for those who asked questions, and thank you everybody for coming along. Much appreciated.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. Always a pleasure. And thank you everybody for attending.
Take care. Stay safe.